You're listening to the Tech for Business Leaders podcast, brought to you by Mazar. This is the podcast where we take technology topics and discuss how business leaders can tackle them. I'm your host, Izan Khan, a privacy specialist at the technology and digital team at Mazar. And throughout this series, we'll be speaking to industry guests, specialist speakers, and subject matter experts about how businesses are taking the latest tech challenges and developments whilst ensuring that they're protected from a risk, security, and compliance perspective. At Mazar, we believe that technology can help businesses, large or small, advance operations, improve productivity, and grow. And so we look forward to sharing knowledge, insights, and practical tips about how businesses can utilize technology to gain a competitive advantage. Now, on with this week's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tech for Leaders podcast by Mazar. For those of you who are new to our podcast, welcome. And for those of our returning listeners, welcome also. I'm Izan, a privacy consultant within Mazar's Technology and Digital, and the host for today's episode. This week, we're going to be discussing environmental, social, and corporate governance, more commonly known by its acronym ESG. For this episode in particular, we're going to be moving past the buzzwords and looking at what ESG fundamentally means, and examining how ESG came to become a critical topic in boardroom conversations, with ESG being mentioned in almost a fifth of earnings calls last year, investor relations, especially with modern investors increasingly looking at non-financial performance indicators for businesses, and the public sphere, for example, with a new suite of more expansive ESG regulations being introduced by the EU and the US. We'll also be looking at and exploring how businesses can demonstrate to stakeholders that they are seriously thinking about and tackling sustainability issues, with specific regard to the role and impact of technology and data along the way. To discuss this topic, I'm really happy to be joined today by Konrad Volker, Director at Mazar's Technology and Digital, whose work spans a range of areas, including reviews of systems and organizations controls, more importantly known as SOC, ESG, and third-party assurance audits. Alongside, we're also joined by the Mazar's lead for ESG and sustainability services, William Hughes. So, welcome, William and Konrad. Glad to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Izan. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Izan.
So, to start us off, let's bring it back to basics. What exactly is ESG? And I'm not talking about just the full form of ESG, as I just explained. What does it fundamentally mean?
That's a great question, Izan. ESG is an acronym. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it takes a holistic view that sustainability is more than just environmental issues. It's best characterized as a framework of managing risks that relate to how you manage opportunities relating to environmental, social, and governance criteria. It's often used in the context of investment management, but stakeholders also exclude others, such as customers, suppliers, and employees. Stakeholders are increasingly interested in how sustainability issues are managed within organizations.
Mm-hmm. And what about your thoughts, William?
I think from a business point of view, what ESG does, it forces you to consider a bit longer term. And I think this is what is become really, really important. I think it's shifted the focus from the immediate for now as to what the future holds. And I think it's been driven by a number of factors. The factors, there can be no denial that we have a climate emergency. There can be no denial that we have massive global inequality. And with those in mind, stakeholders, investors, and not just investors, have realized that the power that ESG can bring, because ESG has financial relevance. It has financial relevance for business, and you can see it in really three ways. The first way is that it's a business case around ESG. Why it's important. The second is that global finance is shifting towards ESG. So ignore it. So you sort of discount yourself from all the opportunities that come with Because, and if I can just reference the PRI, the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment, which has grown, it started in 2006 in New York, has grown from $6 trillion of assets under management in 2006 with a handful of investors to $121.3 trillion of assets under management as at the end of 2021. Demonstrating that shift, and these are asset owners, asset managers, shifting their investments towards ESG-linked funds. Now, what does that mean? It means if you're not in that, if you're not in that, you're going to find yourself very much irrelevant. And the third, of course, as you mentioned, is regulation. Regulation is will be driving business towards considering ESG. But our view is that regulation and compliance should be a byproduct of the value add.
It's interesting that you mentioned the UN, because ESG as a term stems from a 2004 UN-led initiative, which led to a publication of a study in 2005 called Who Cares Wins. But we well knew about the problems with climate change and inequality back then. And ESG was largely untouched by organizations up until 2018, 2019, because during that whole period, I mentioned a statistic in the intro that over a fifth of all earnings calls in the past year referenced ESG. But that was a shift that happened from 2019. Up until that point, it was actually less than 1%. So there was an exponential bit of growth in people and organizations considering ESG. So what do you think are the factors that drove that massive adoption in the past couple of years?
I think, let me go first there, Conrad. I think that we talk about a climate emergency, but it's backed by science, but it's backed by tragic events that are regularly taking place today. We have fires, we have floods, and that's affecting many parts of the globe, and affecting many. And who's taking the brunt of it? It's mainly the poorer communities that are taking, the developing world are taking the brunt of it. So that's focused our attention. I think the pandemic has also focused our attention on the fact that we're not as bulletproof as we thought we are. And suddenly we were extremely vulnerable to a situation that we say, well, business as usual is no longer acceptable. And having a connected world with technology and social media, it's no longer acceptable to do what you please and hurt what you please and extract what you please without consequence. So I think that those factors are driving that and I think stakeholder, we talk of stakeholder capitalism, which I think is a very important topic around, most organizations are for profit. Of course, we have B Corp, which is changing that view. But this stakeholder capitalism is really coming into play, where stakeholders matter and their voice matters and they have power.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are seeing that sort of shift. Sorry, I want to go back to Conrad and ask what your views are and why ESG has become such a big...
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As Willem has outlined, we can't just go at the current pace. We're going to lose the race. Incremental change isn't good enough. And it's not just about saving the planet. It's about creating an equitable society as well. And goodwill and best intentions aren't enough. We need a real reset in terms of what we do. And reality is people do what they are measured on. So increased regulation and reporting is an absolute driver for that. And that has really focused the mind in my experience.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, where it's no longer possible, strictly speaking, that people just try to temper their own behaviors and consumptions as individuals. We require governments and organizations at large to also consider their sustainability practices. Moving on from what you just said, it's important to be able to measure these sustainability metrics as a result of regulations and as a result of changing business appetite for these things. So I want to ask you, how do you actually measure environmental, social, or governance metrics or aspects? What's the approach that you take?
If I could start, Izan, I think we have certain standards that have been put into play. We have organizations like the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, that has produced a set of standards. But what you found is that there's been too many different organizations have come up, and it's become extremely difficult to actually understand what is going on because there are so many organizations out there measuring. I think what we need is something similar to how we report on financially. And I think where we are quite fortunate now at COP26, they launched the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that with an objective of providing a set of standards for non-financial reporting in a similar way to how we do financial reporting. So I think that's fundamentally. If you want to go into more detail in terms of the E, the S, and the G, I think in every aspect of ESG, there's an opportunity to measure and to set KPIs. If you look at in terms of carbon reporting, measuring your greenhouse gases over the 3 scopes, it's important. You can set KPIs around that, set reduction targets around that. A lot of the companies are doing that. In terms of the S metrics, it's around diversity and inclusion, gender pay gap, staff turnover, and so there's. But having said that, I think every organization has got different aspects to consider. And when we talk about ESG with organizations, we talk about materiality, understanding what is material for you, and then and driving measurement and metrics around that so that it becomes relevant for you. Because it's not a cut and paste. Everything is different. And I think around governance, stakeholder management, transparency, board independence. There's so for every single aspect of ESG, there's ways of measuring, and I think it's important that we do, because talk is cheap, but performance is what's really important. And I think what we're going to talk about around assurance is going to come into this conversation, because that is of course very important.
Of course, yeah. Sorry.
Absolutely. I agree with what William has said. Everyone's got a lovely story about how seriously they take ESG, but it needs to be more than a story. You need some really defined metrics that you can compare others against, that you have benchmarks. And that's why we have these protocols and reporting measures. I think they're really important.
And how does it work in practice then for organizations who intend to go through those processes? What exactly will you be looking at or taking into account specifically to an organization? So, for example, you'd be looking at things like supply chains and looking at the third parties that you interact with. Another aspect of the S in ESG is looking at, for example, modern slavery and ensuring that you don't have anything in your supply chain that touches something remotely like that. So going specifically to the topic of third-party audits and assurance audits in an ESG context, how would that work for organizations? What exactly would you be looking at?
Yeah, there are various protocols, as we've talked about. For example, there's scope 1, 2, and 3 when it comes to carbon emissions. That's more William's world. But scope 3, for example, will look at your supply chain as well. It won't just be what you use directly or what you source. It will include your supply chain. When it comes to third-party assurance, there you can look at some of the processes and controls that can help generate that information and validate the source and add more credibility to that.
And where do you see the future of ESG going?
Well, one thing's for certain: it's here, and it's here to stay.
Of course.
There's no going back. You ignore it. You do so at your peril to become irrelevant, because your stakeholders will simply not find that acceptable. I think, in my opinion, in 3 to 5 years, we won't be really considering it as a separate issue. I think we will be reporting on non-financial matters in a similar way that we do our finances today. And under the auspices of the ISSB, I think that's entirely possible. And I think that we will it'll be business as usual, that we will have to report it. And I think that will be backed by regulation. So that it won't be sort of an option anymore that you can, whether you're going to do it or not, because that has been one of the areas that has made it's so sort of a reluctance for especially some of the smaller companies to engage. And I think that when you produce a set of an annual report, the finances, the non-finances will be there and it'll be assured. That's for me is the future.
What about yourself, Conrad?
I agree totally. I think it will just be baked into the normal reporting that investors require. So like we do financial statement reporting, that will include an element of ESG reporting. Everyone will do it. There will be assurance over it. I think it will be business as usual.
Sure. It's one thing for organizations to ignore ESG, but it's another thing entirely to do things like greenwashing. We've seen fines and sanctions being dished out to entities like BNY Mellon and Ryanair for alleged greenwashing claims in their advertising or their reporting. What would you consider to be examples of greenwashing in practice, and how can companies avoid that by inadvertently maybe being accused of something like that?
Greenwashing is a serious problem that we face today. Greenwashing is where organizations claim certain environmental excellence without having any backing to back it. We see examples every day on TV adverts. We see examples in the press, in reports, and it's driven by a fact that a lot of non-financial reporting is not assured. So it's an organization will use it as a marketing exercise to try and blow their, to boost their credibility. And quite frankly, we've had enough of that. And we've had enough of that, and hence our push for assurance of a non-financial reporting is becoming exceedingly important, because we simply cannot believe a report that's not assured, a third party assured. That is the reality, and I speak for myself, and I speak for many stakeholders out there. That where's this belief that you can use this as a marketing tool is so wrong.
It's more fundamental than just saying that, oh yeah, we're compliant, we're doing all of these things to improve sustainability, but another thing to actually demonstrate that very tangibly in what you do in organizational practices, right?
Well, we have some really some examples of organizations winning sustainability awards, yet their employees are on strike. Now, how do you actually bring those together?
Yeah.
It's, that's just fundamentally where. Because it's a culture. It's a culture around the organization. That's what ESG and sustainability is. It's set from the top, and if it's not throughout your organization, it's greenwashing.
Of course. So let's move the conversation to actually implementing all this organizationally, but with a specific focus on technology. So what technology trends do you see businesses adopting in order to improve their sustainability practices? Or to put it on the flip side, what current practices are businesses not sufficiently giving enough thought about in terms of how the tech that they use could be harmful to their ESG agendas? I'll throw that to you first, Conrad.
Yeah, from a technology point of view, the pandemic has been good in the sense that it has shown us we don't have to be in the office to do our job effectively. We interact with our teams, with our clients virtually through Zoom, Teams, whatever technology, and that works. And that helped us to rethink whether we really have to make that business trip, whether we can't do it another way. So I think technology has played a big role in that. Also, technology helps us to look at how we can reduce waste, how we do better reporting over our usage, our interaction with the environment and in the office. Those are just some examples in terms of how we can change our practices for the benefit of the environment.
What about yourself, William?
I think technology's got a massive role to play in ESG reporting going forward. I think we've just sort of scratching the surface at the moment, where we have the use of like carbon calculators that is there, so to really enhance your carbon reporting. We have things like ESG health checks that we use it through a digital platform, so we can really sort of be able to enhance. But I think what is coming, in my opinion, is that like and I again refer back to financial reporting. We're going to have software that's going to be used, that's going to assist us in this process. So if you have a Sage or QuickBooks or whatever, they're going to have a non-financial component, so that you can capture your non-financial data as you do your financial data. And that has to happen, because what we find is that companies find it challenging to get all this data outside of their finances, because they've got to go and look for it. If you're looking for an invoice and you've got to look for the kilowatt hours on how much electricity you've used, that's simply not captured generally at the moment. Of course, it's starting to grow, and there are certain companies that do, but that needs to be standard practice. And I think that's really where this big opportunity lies.
Of course. And what about practices that are happening right now within organizations in a technological sense that you think could potentially be harmful to the general ESG agendas of their, you can think of any, maybe like excessive data center use, for example, or focusing more, I guess, on the social side of ESG, looking at how personal data might be used in ways that might breach the privacy of individuals. I can think of a lot of ways where, again, this is one example of how ESG is so focused on the environmental side of things, but not necessarily looking at the impact technology can have on things like human rights. So I definitely do think that there are a couple of ways that organizations can improve their organizational practices and technological practices.
I agree. I'll give you a real-life example. Data centers, for example, use a lot of power for cooling, and there are now efforts to look at how else can you achieve that. It could be cooling under the sea, for example, whether you can move some of the data centers there. So there's a constant look at technology as to how you can improve efficiency.
But with the increasing use of technology, especially since the pandemic, how does that reconcile with a broader sustainability goal for organizations that weren't actually using technology in the first place and were, for example, going into work because they were local? What do you feel like the extensive use of technology in our lives and the pressures that it places on the infrastructure of those technologies like data centers, and how the internet needs to be very, very replicated so we don't lose personal data, for example? How does that reconcile with the fact that, for example, we're just not traveling as much anymore? Do you think one offsets the other, or do you think we're moving maybe from one visible kind of harm to another more insidious, invisible kind?
I think it's hard for me to comment on that. I don't really know what the impact of that is. I think that the pandemic has shown that we can do things differently. We can work differently. I think, but for any organization, when one examines one's impacts, one has to do it like that and understand exactly what, so any sort of decision that you take around, whether it's technology or anything, needs to have an ESG lens. And then having that ESG lens then gives you the opportunity to say, well, by doing this, are we going to create more damage to the environment? Are we going to create more damage in terms of society? And the decision is taken around that. But I don't think I'd like to sort of give examples. I simply don't know what they are. We do know that less travel equals less emissions. We know that's a fact.
Sure.
I mean, and we found that we can work outside of offices, and I think that's something we know. Now, how we manage that in terms of going forward is really it depends on a lot of circumstances, what kind of business you're in, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of around data centers, and obviously data privacy is a fundamental human right, and that cannot be. There's no compromise on that, and I think it's very important that that's put into play. But I think we just need to be careful not to generalize too much and saying, well, these are the pluses and these are the minuses, because everything is different, and everything needs to be examined carefully around that. But if you take it with the ESG lens, then you've got a really good foundation.
You make a good point that there is a trade-off. If you just look at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, a goal might be improved quality of life. For some people, they might see that's having the latest iPhone or spending more on technology. So that has an environmental impact. So there is a bit of a trade-off in terms of measuring the good and the bad and offsetting or deciding where your focus lies. Where's the greatest benefit and where's the greatest harm?
And so it's up to organizations really based on their business models to determine what works for them as well as what works for their customers and broader society.
Absolutely. And I think it's all about visibility.
And transparency.
And transparency. So, Conrad, why do we need assurance fundamentally?
That's a great question, Izan. I'm glad you asked it. I like to use an analogy of online shopping. We've all bought something online from a seller that we know very little or nothing about. And the seller always makes some representations about their product because they want to sell it. But as a user, we tend to take that with a pinch of salt because we don't know whether we can trust them or not. So for me, assurance is having someone that can provide that independent view about that product. Have they used it before? Are they independent? Is it any good? If I translate that into the business world, it's about independence. You want someone that is not related to the subject matter, that has credibility in the market, and can assess that subject based on a set of rules or criteria or methodology. And that's where the different standards come in. The standards provide you with that set of rules around objectivity, about independence. And then you have the supporting protocols, such as the greenhouse gas protocol, which is the set of rules that determine the scope and the measurements that you assess that. And looking at that, you can provide that independent assurance, which can be either reasonable assurance or limited assurance, but it gives you some comfort to say, yes, what I'm presented with, I can take some additional comfort from.
And that's the importance of independent work on it. So loads of metrics and colorful charts, they don't just suffice, do they?
Absolutely not. That's also where greenwashing comes in. You don't want to take everything just at face value. You need to trust but verify. You need some kind of mechanism to validate that what is being presented.
William, what are your thoughts?
I think I've said it already around that we simply don't believe a report that's not assured anymore because of the marketing angle that organizations have taken to try and build themselves up without substance. So I think fundamentally it is important to have a third-party assurance. I think in terms of regulation that we've talked about earlier on in the chat, you'll find is going to include assurance as part of the package, as it is with financial reporting. So it's something that's really necessary. It helps to build trust and helps us gives us confidence in what's being produced.
Absolutely. We see an increase in consulting organizations generally like having ESG consulting and assurance as part of their normal suite of assurance and advisory packages that they put forward to organizations. And what are we at Mazar doing in that department? Is there anything interesting that you'd like to share?
Absolutely. So this comes back to credibility. We at Mazar work together quite frequently in that William's team has a deep subject matter expertise around the ESG related subjects, the greenhouse gas protocols, etc. And then my team focuses really on assurance. So through that combination, we can add real depth and breadth to provide that assurance, which I think is a very positive and unique offering.
Course. So out of all of the things that we've discussed today, what should a key takeaway for business leaders be? I'll give you one each.
Well, from my side, I think I've said it. I think ESG is here to stay. I think it's really important we understand it. We bring it into our organizations. It becomes part of what we do. Ignore it at your peril.
Ignore it at your peril. Conrad?
Absolutely, I agree. It's here to stay. We do what we are measured on. Greater reporting and regulation will be a driver for change. It is definitely here to stay. It's a force for the good.
It's a force for good. Thanks to our guests, Conrad and William. Thank you.
Thanks, Izan.
My pleasure.
That brings this week's episode of the Tech for Business Leaders podcast with Mazar to a close. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe to the series and leave a review to extend our reach and keep technology at the heart of the business community. We look forward to sharing more with you in our next episode, but for now, take care and thank you for listening.